The first thing Lieutenant Walter Brandt remembered was the cold. Not the cold of altitude, but a deeper chill, one that began in the bones and worked its way out like a warning. At 23,000 feet over the North Sea, inside the narrow waist of the B-17 Iron Lantern, cold was as common as oxygen. Yet this was different. It felt like the air itself sensed what was coming long before the crew did. He glanced out the small port window and saw the sun rising behind the formation, long golden rays slicing across the contrails of the other flying fortresses. They were arranged in their tight combat boxes, engines humming, bound for another strike against the factories the Reich insisted were untouchable. For a brief moment, the view seemed peaceful, almost serene. Then the radio crackled with the sound no bomber crew ever forgot. Bandits. 50 plus. Closing fast. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Inside the cockpit, Captain Roland Hayes tightened his grip on the yoke. The formation's escorts were scattered, chasing decoys thrown by the Luftwaffe. They were alone. Hayes didn't curse or tense, though Walter knew he saw the same truth flickering in the captain's eyes they'd been set up. The briefing had insisted intelligence detected minimal fighter presence, but minimal didn't come diving at them in a black, shrieking storm of Messerschmitts. Even before the first Bf-109 slashed through the top of the formation, the radio chatter dissolved into overlapping shouts. Hayes kept Iron Lantern steady, its engines rumbling, its frame vibrating under the strain of the air and the weight of fate tightening above them. Walter watched the lead elements erupt into defense fire, tracer streams weaving like frantic strokes of light in a sky turning violent. The ambush unfolded in seconds. The Bf-109 seconds came in from 12 o'clock high, sunlight flashing off their wings, guns hammering. A bomber 2 ships ahead burst into flames, spiraling downward in a long, arcing descent that left a black ribbon of smoke trailing across the morning sky. Walter felt his stomach twist, but forced himself to the right waist window, bracing his boots, gripping the handles of his .50 caliber. The cold metal vibrated under his palms as he tracked one of the fighters streaking in from the beam. The Messerschmitt seemed to float for a heartbeat, its engine screaming, its pilot visible for a haunting instant, young, focused, unshaken. Walter squeezed the triggers, the twin guns roaring back with the fury of a cornered animal. Tracers arced across the space between them, and the fighter rolled away, disappearing beneath the formation. His breath fogged against the glass as he scanned for the next threat. The second wave hit harder. The entire bomber group staggered as if the sky itself recoiled. The formation, so carefully constructed, now bent and twisted under the relentless pressure. Hayes kept his voice calm over the interphone, ordering minor corrections, adjusting throttle by instinct. Flak hadn't even started yet, and already they were bleeding altitude, losing ships, losing men. Walter spotted another fighter making a head-on pass toward the cockpit. The top turret hammered at it, but the Bf-109 held its line, firing until the last possible second before peeling away. The shockwave rattled the plane. Glass fragments danced in the air. Hayes was shouting something, though Walter could barely hear over the ringing in his ears. Then the deep, metallic groan filled the fuselage. Something had been hit, something vital. The radio operator's voice cracked with fear, reporting that the number 3 engine was smoking. Walter smelled it before he saw it, burning oil mixing with the high-altitude air. The engine didn't fail immediately, but it coughed, sputtered, and shook with a violent, uneven rhythm that promised nothing good. The bomber fell slightly out of position, and instantly predators sensed weakness. 2 Bf-109 seconds dove straight at them, guns sparkling. Walter opened fire, the recoil slamming against his shoulders. The fighters roared past, but not before bullets stitched the tail section. The tail gunner, a kid barely old enough to shave, screamed over the mic, then fell silent. Walter's chest tightened, but there was no time to think, no time to mourn. Hayes forced the bomber back into formation, though Walter knew it wouldn't hold. The engine's smoke thickened, trailing behind them like a desperate signal to the enemy. As the German fighters regrouped, Walter felt a heat building in his throat, not anger, but a raw, helpless determination not to be torn from the sky. For a moment he imagined the Liberty ship he'd once sailed on months earlier, the Port Clarion, when he'd been transferred overseas. It had taken a torpedo off Ireland, the blast shaking the entire vessel. Everyone had thought they were done for, even the attacking U-boat crew, who had surfaced just long enough for their captain to witness, in stunned disbelief, that the ship refused to sink. Water had poured in, bulkheads had groaned, and the deck had buckled, but somehow the freighter kept moving, limping toward safety. Walter had clung to the railing that night, staring into the dark waves lit only by emergency lamps, knowing that survival could come from the narrowest margin. Survival in the air felt even narrower. The third wave of fighters slashed in, and the formation scattered involuntarily. The neat geometry broke apart into drifting fragments of battered aircraft. Walter fired again, his ears ringing, his lungs burning with frozen air. Below them, far below, he saw the faint coastline creeping closer. Their target was inland, but the Navy's convoys he recalled from the Liberty ship days were somewhere beyond that horizon, engaged in battles equally brutal. He wondered, impossibly, what was unfolding on the seas even now, while they fought for a sky they barely controlled. The Messerschmitts regrouped for another run, and Walter realized with a hollow dread that the bomber groups around them were crumbling. AB-17 above them detonated in a burst of flame, the shockwave rattling iron lantern. Walter ducked instinctively as debris tumbled past, a tire spinning through the air before dropping into the clouds below. The radio operator shouted that they'd lost contact with the lead group entirely. They were now flying blind, wounded, and alone inside a sky turning into a graveyard. Hayes ordered everyone to stay alert, but even his voice carried the strain of inevitability. Then, just as Walter reloaded another belt of ammunition, a sudden flash erupted off their left wing, not an explosion, but reflected sunlight. A thin opening in the cloud cover revealed shimmering ocean far beneath them. For a moment, the world seemed impossibly distant and calm. But the Messerschmitts didn't pause. They dove again, faster, angrier, as if determined to erase the remaining bombers from the sky. Tracers tore past the waist gun windows, some punching through the fuselage with sharp bursts of sound. Walter fired, tracking a fighter that overshot, fragments of metal flashing away from its right wing. It didn't fall, but it limped, sputtering smoke, peeling away toward the horizon. It was a small victory, but one that steadied his heartbeat. The assault finally eased. The fighters pulled away, circling for a moment like hawks, deciding whether to strike again. But then the call came. Allied escorts returning. Distant specks rose from below P-47, thunderbolts climbing, engines roaring. The Messerschmitts recognized the shift instantly and broke off, vanishing into the sunlit haze. Silence returned slowly, like a hesitant guest, unsure whether it was welcome. Walter sagged against his gun mount, sweat freezing along the sides of his helmet. Hayes exhaled audibly over the interphone. The bomber wasn't safe, not by miles, but they were still airborne. They limped toward the target, each minute stretching into an hour. When the flak began, it felt almost inevitable, a grim punctuation mark on everything they had endured. Black clouds blossomed around them, each burst shoving the bomber off balance. Walter held his breath, braced by the waist window, as shrapnel peppered the fuselage. The ground below blurred with smoke and flashes from anti-aircraft batteries. Hayes guided the bomber through the storm, voice steady again. They released their payload, the bomber jolting upward with newfound lightness. Then they turned back toward friendly territory, engines groaning, frame rattling, but still whole enough to carry them home. Hours later, long after the coastline returned beneath them, long after the fighters disappeared, and the tension eased into exhaustion, the crew began to breathe again. Walter leaned against the cold metal, eyes half closed, feeling the rhythmic pulse of the engines. He knew this wasn't the end of the war, not for them, not for anyone. Somewhere across the Pacific, other men fought in jungles and tunnels, pressed into darkness, lit only by flashlights and muzzle flashes. He imagined Marines crawling through Japanese tunnels, rifles raised, heartbeats thunderous in tight spaces where danger breathed on their necks. War was everywhere on the sea where Liberty ships refused to sink, in the air where B-17 seconds clawed through ambushes, and underground where Marines fought shadows that shot back. As the bomber approached its airfield, daylight fading into a deepening orange horizon, Walter watched the ground rise gently to meet them. They touched down harder than usual, tires screeching, the bomber trembling as if relieved to be back on Earth. When they rolled to a stop, the crew remained silent for a moment, absorbing the miracle of their survival. Hayes finally removed his oxygen mask, revealing eyes reddened by wind and fatigue. "We made it," he whispered, though the words carried both triumph and the weight of those who hadn't. Walter stepped onto the tarmac, boots hitting solid ground with a heaviness he felt through every bone. Mechanics rushed toward them, medics in tow, officers waiting with clipboards. But their voices seemed distant. What he felt more than anything was the echo of the sky, the roar, the chaos, the cold, and the fierce refusal to fall. He looked back at the scarred bomber, its skin punctured, its tail shredded, one engine darkened by soot. It seemed impossible that this machine had held them together through the storm. Yet it had, just as the Port Clarion had endured its torpedo, just as Marines somewhere held their ground in tunnels carved by enemy hands. War, Walter realized, wasn't only destruction. It was defiance. It was endurance. It was the stubborn, unyielding will to survive even when the odds twisted against you with the force of 50 fighters screaming out of the sun. He breathed deeply, tasting dust, oil, and the faint lingering scent of gunpowder. Tomorrow they would fly again. Tomorrow the sky would demand more courage, more sacrifice, more hope. But tonight, for the first time in days, he allowed himself to feel a measure of peace, a fragile, fleeting peace, but real enough to savor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The crew gathered near the bomber, leaning on one another, some lighting cigarettes with shaking hands. Hayes approached Walter, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Hell of a day," he murmured. Walter nodded. Words felt small compared to the weight of what they'd endured. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving only fading streaks of red across the darkening sky. For a moment, Walter imagined all the fronts of the war converging into one shared, heartbeat airmen, sailors, infantry, Marines in tunnels so dark they could barely see their own hands. They all fought different battles, but they were bound by the same thread, the hope that somehow, against impossible odds, they would live long enough to see peace again. And as the night settled over the airfield, Walter felt that hope, faint but steady, flickering inside him like the stubborn flame of a lantern refusing to be extinguished. The moon was high when Walter finally drifted into restless sleep, the cot beneath him creaking every time he shifted. The airfield was quiet now, engines dormant, tools silent, and radios offering only the soft crackle of distant static. Yet, even in the stillness, echoes of the day haunted him, flashes of ascending Messerschmitts, the tail gunner's final scream, the trembling of iron lantern as it fought to stay aloft. Sleep offered no peace, it only magnified the fragments he tried to forget. In dreams, he was still firing, still breathing that freezing thin air, still feeling the bomber's skin shudder beneath his gloves. And always, just at the edge of vision, the face of the young German pilot he'd nearly killed, eyes calm and eerily human. He woke before dawn, gasping, the thin quilt tangled around his legs. Outside, the camp stirred with muted footsteps and the distant clatter of pots in the mess tent. For a few seconds he didn't know where he was. The dream felt too real. Then he heard Hayes's familiar voice from across the barracks, quiet, measured, checking on the crew as though the role of captain never ceased. Walter sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, trying to push aside the lingering fog of broken sleep. He dressed and stepped into the icy morning air. The horizon glowed faintly, a promise of sunrise. Mechanics were already at work around the battered B-17 seconds, lined up like wounded giants waiting for surgeons. Walter looked toward Iron Lantern, its aluminum skin patched with early morning frost. The plane looked smaller now, more fragile in the pale light. Where daylight once glinted off its wings with pride, now shadows clung to its bullet holes, tracing the scars of yesterday's ambush. A figure stood beside it, the crew chief, a wiry man named Branson with grease permanently embedded under his nails. He nodded to Walter, though his expression carried the same tired heaviness. "We'll get her flying again," Branson said quietly. "She's stubborn. Kinda like her crew." Walter managed a faint smile. "We'll need her stubborn today too." Branson's eyes flicked toward the sky, as if hoping for a sign. "Weather looks clear, that's something." But the clarity of the sky only meant that if enemy fighters found them, there would be nothing to hide behind. Walter walked the length of the bomber, fingertips brushing its cold surface. Every dent, every scar was a story, some he remembered, some he had never known. He found himself pausing at the tail, the gaping holes, where bullets had torn through. He could almost hear the young gunner's voice again, cracking with fear and adrenaline. The loss settled on his shoulders like unseen weight. He wondered how many more empty bunks would appear before the war ended. The others joined him gradually. Ned the bombardier, bruised but still ready. Smitty, the top turret gunner, eyes bloodshot. The radio operator, carrying a notebook filled with names, numbers, and coded fragments that rarely made sense to anyone outside his world. Hayes arrived last, a steaming mug in hand, face drawn but steady. "We have a briefing in 15, he said. "But first look at her." They all turned toward Iron Lantern. Morning light slowly illuminated the bomber's battered frame, revealing the stubborn shine beneath its damage. Hayes set down his mug and placed a hand on the nose of the aircraft. "We came back yesterday when we shouldn't have," he said softly. "Because somewhere today, another crew is going to need us. Maybe a ship at sea is holding on by a thread. Maybe some Marines on an island across the world are trapped in a tunnel, waiting for us to cut off the supply lines above them. Maybe someone's last hope depends on a bomber group holding together in the sky." The crew listened, silent, the weight of his words sinking deep. "That's why we fly." Moments later, they walked to the briefing hut. Maps covered the walls, red yarn marking enemy positions, blue lines marking planned flight paths. The air smelled of cigarette smoke, chalk dust, and damp wool. Officers spoke in clipped tones, outlining the day's mission. A deep strike on German fuel depots, heavily protected, but critical. Intelligence suggested flak concentrations would be thick. Fighter escort would be available, but not until after the first 70 miles. Walter felt a tremor of unease. Yesterday's ambush had taught them what delayed escort meant. After the briefing, he stepped outside alone, letting the cold air sting his face. He thought not of planes or maps, but of something older stories he had heard from Marines fighting in tunnels on Pacific islands, of men crawling on hands and knees through darkness so thick it felt alive. Flashlight beams slicing through cramped corridors carved into volcanic rock, rifles shouldered in silence as danger waited around every bend. He imagined the terror of fighting in a place where there was no sky, no escape, only echoes of footsteps and the stifling heat of the earth itself. And yet those men pushed forward. If they could endure that, he thought, he could endure the sky once more. The crew boarded Iron Lantern as the sun rose. Engines coughed awake one by one, sending vibrations through the ground. Walter strapped in, the familiar smell of oil and metal filling his lungs. Hayes ran through the pre-flight checklist with steady hands. When the brakes released, the bomber rolled forward, joining the long procession of flying fortresses. One by one, they lifted into the pale morning sky, each bearing the weight of those who had flown before and those who never returned. Climbing through the clouds felt like ascending into another world, a world where sunlight glowed serene and the air shimmered with cold purity. But Walter knew serenity was temporary. The sky had teeth. They formed up with the other B-17 seconds, dozens of silver shapes gliding in tight formation. Walter scanned the horizon through his waist-gun window, searching for any movement. Minutes stretched. Radio chatter remained calm, controlled. The first 70 miles passed without incident. Then Smitty's voice crackled through the interphone. Contact, high, closing fast. Walter's heartbeat sharpened. He pressed his face to the glass. At first he saw nothing but sky, endless, empty. Then the sun glinted off wings slicing in from above. A formation of enemy fighters, moving with precision. Messerschmitts, Smitty growled. A whole pack. Walter steadied his grip on the .50 caliber handles. Fear pooled in his stomach, pooling like the cold oil that once soaked the deck of the Liberty ship after the torpedo hit. He thought again of the German U-boat crew staring in disbelief as the freighter refused to sink. He wondered if the Bf-109 pilots felt that same disbelief yesterday when Iron Lantern rose from the smoke and clawed its way home. The fighters dove. Tracer fire filled the sky. Bombers shook under impact. Walter fired, the gun chattering violently. The smell of gunpowder and hot metal flooded the small compartment. Fighters slashed between them, weaving through the formation with practiced aggression. One bomber exploded in front of them, flame blossoming outward like a sudden sunrise. Debris scattered. Walter ducked as a fragment of wing ricocheted off the fuselage. Radio calls overlapped in frantic bursts. Left wing hit. Tail controls are, he's on my 6, he's the world narrowed to chaos. Walter tracked a fighter charging directly at them. His vision tunneled. He fired, tracers lacing the sky. The fighter jerked, smoke trailing from its engine before it spiraled downward, disappearing into cloud. Relief was fleeting. Another enemy dove at the tail. Smitty fired. Sparks erupted across the German plane's fuselage, but it held formation, its guns flashing. A sudden impact rocked Iron Lantern, throwing Walter against the fuselage. The plane lurched. The No. 2 engine sputtered. Hayes fought to steady the aircraft, voice hoarse as he issued orders. The Messerschmitts regrouped for a second run. Before they could strike, new shapes appeared sleek, fast, climbing hard. P-51 Mustangs. Relief tore through the formation as the American fighters streaked in, guns blazing. The enemy peeled away, forced into dogfights against faster, more agile opponents. The sky erupted into twisting trails of smoke and fire. The bombers held formation. They pushed, forward. They reached the target massive fuel depots clustered like metal giants along the ground. Flak burst around them in deafening black clouds. Walter felt each impact vibrate through the plane's bones. The bombardier released the payload, and moments later the ground below erupted into columns of flame. Secondary explosions blossomed outward, fuel tanks igniting in monstrous fireballs. Hayes turned the bomber toward home. But home was far away. Flak followed them for miles. Fighters harried them on and off. The sky dimmed. Clouds gathered. Iron Lantern struggled, wounded but still aloft. The No. 2 engine sputtered continuously, threatening to die. Hours passed. At last, the coastline appeared. Walter slumped in relief until a final burst of flak erupted beneath them. A violent explosion slammed into the underbelly. Walter was thrown sideways. The bomber dropped sharply. Hydraulic lines hit. Hayes shouted. "We're losing pressure!" They limped toward the airfield, altitude barely holding. The landing gear refused to deploy. Fuel leaked steadily. "Brace for a belly landing," Hayes commanded. Walter grabbed hold of anything bolted down. The ground rushed up to meet them. The bomber struck soil with a grinding roar, metal screaming as sparks flew along the fuselage. The world spun. The plane slid, shuddering, then finally groaned to a stop. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then one by one, they stirred. Walter stumbled out into blinding daylight, boots sinking into churned earth. Behind him, Iron Lantern lay broken, smoke curling gently from its belly. They had survived again, but Walter knew the war was far from over. Across the world, Marines were still advancing through tunnels, ships were still dodging torpedoes, fighters were still ambushing bombers. And tomorrow or the next day, the sky would call them back. Hayes stepped beside him, breathing hard. "Get some rest," he said. "We're still flying, and there's a lot left to do." Walter nodded, staring at the wrecked bomber, feeling something fierce rising within him. Endurance. defiance, the unbroken will to survive a war that refused to end. They walked back toward the camp together, leaving the battered plane behind but carrying the fire of its spirit within them. Night arrived with a heaviness that pressed into the camp like an unspoken warning. The wreckage of Iron Lantern sat alone at the far end of the airfield, floodlights illuminating its torn belly and twisted metal. Mechanics moved around it quietly. Not to repair, no one could fix what that last mission had done but to salvage. Bolts clinked onto tool trays. Panels were removed. The bomber was dissolving piece by piece. Walter watched from a distance, feeling as though a part of him was being dismantled along with it. Hayes approached silently, hands shoved into the pockets of his flight jacket. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying with it the faint smell of fuel and damp soil. "She did her job," Hayes murmured. Walter nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. "Feels wrong to let her go." "That's war," Hayes replied. "Everything you care about gets tested until it breaks. People, planes, even hope. The trick is to keep flying anyway." Walter breathed out slowly. "Do we know what plane we're assigned next?" "Not yet. Command is juggling assets. Too many losses the past week." Hayes paused, then added quietly, "We might be assigned to a replacement ship. A new one. Or—" his voice trailed off. "Or what? Or we get reassigned to another crew." The thought hit harder than Walter expected. Their crew wasn't just a collection of men, they were a living machine, each part necessary. Breaking them apart felt like erasing something that had survived too much to be neatly reshuffled. Walter clenched his jaw, looking back at Iron Lantern. "I don't want another ship," he whispered. Hayes placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "We don't get to choose. We only get to keep going." For a long moment, the two stood in silence. Then, as if summoned by the very weight of the moment, a distant rumble echoed across the airfield. At first, it sounded like thunder. But thunder didn't move in formation. Engines multiple grew louder, approaching from the northeast. Searchlights swung skyward. "Returning bomber group!" someone shouted. But the tone of that shout carried dread. They weren't on a scheduled return window. Walter and Hayes ran toward the edge of the tarmac as dark shapes materialized through the night. B-24 Liberators, 5 of them, limping home like wounded birds, one missing an entire section of its tail, another flying with one engine feathered, spitting sparks. They came in low, too low. The first touched down hard, bouncing violently before skidding sideways, dirt flying in a wide plume. Ambulance crews raced across the field. The radio tower crackled with frantic chatter. Walter stiffened. Another bomber descended, flaming fuel trailing from its wingtip. The moment it hit the ground, the flame raced across the tarmac like a living creature. Men shouted. Fire crews scrambled. This was no ordinary return. They'd been ambushed again and torn apart. Walter felt a chill settle in his gut. The enemy was pushing harder than ever. He didn't sleep that night. None of the crew did. They gathered in the mess hall, drinking lukewarm coffee, barely speaking. Every now and then, someone would look toward the door as another group of survivors limped in faces covered in oil, eyes glassy, uniforms torn. Nothing needed to be said. War's shadow had lengthened. At dawn, command delivered their orders. "You're being reassigned," Hayes told them, holding a slip of paper with the new plane number. "They're giving us a new fortress, brand new, straight from the factory." The crew exchanged glances, surprise, disbelief, a flicker of pride. A new blazer, plane was rare, symbolic, important. Walter felt hope stir faintly, though he didn't fully trust it. They walked together across the airfield toward the hangar where the new B-17 waited, still gleaming beneath rising sunlight. As they approached, the reflective silver skin made the plane seem almost ethereal, untouched by the cruelty of combat. Her name was stenciled on the nose. Night Beacon Smitty whistled softly. "She looks unreal." Hayes smiled for the first time in days. "Let's make sure she stays that way." Walter ran his hand along the smooth metal. It felt impossibly clean, like something sacred. He remembered the Port Clarion again, the Liberty ship, refusing to die under the weight of a torpedo. He remembered the echoes of Marines fighting in tunnels so dark even nightmares would refuse to enter. And he remembered Iron Lantern, the battered old fortress that had carried them through hell. Night Beacon would inherit all of them. They began pre-flight rituals with reverence. Everything felt sharper, every buckle, every lever, every gauge. Walter strapped into his waist, gun position, the metal cold against his palms. For a moment, he closed his eyes and imagined the sky as it would soon appear, endless, shimmering, deadly. They took off at dawn 2 days later. The engines purred with a confidence that lifted everyone's spirits. The bomber climbed effortlessly, joining a formation of other newly repaired or newly assigned ships. The sun rose across the horizon, bathing their silver wings in gold. But the mission wasn't a bombing run. Not this time. Their orders were reconnaissance deep behind enemy lines, mapping rail networks, fuel sites, and convoy routes that fed the increasingly desperate Axis defense. Dangerous work. No payload to lighten or stabilize the plane. No distraction of the bombing run. Only the long, vulnerable flight into hostile territory with cameras replacing bombs. As they crossed into enemy airspace, Walter's grip tightened. The sky remained clear for an hour, then 2, then 3. False safety made every minute worse. Finally, as the ground below shifted from rolling farmland to industrial sprawl, Smitty spoke through the interphone. Movement. 2 o'clock high. Walter searched the sky. Shapes emerged faint at first, then unmistakable. Not fighters. Bombers. German. He 111 seconds, climbing in a staggered formation. And flanking them. Fighters, Walter said. A lot of them. Hayes' voice remained steady. Stay sharp. Cameras rolling. We complete the pass. The Heinkels broke formation. Fighters swooped. The sky shattered. Night Beacon jolted violently as cannon fire burst around them. Walter swung the .50 caliber in a wide arc, tracking targets. The fighters moved differently than BF 109 seconds, more aggressive, more desperate, flying like pilots who had nothing left to lose. Tracer rounds stitched across the wing. The plane dipped. Walter fired until the gun grew hot beneath his gloves. A fighter burst into flame and spiraled downward, but others replaced it instantly. The Heinkels dropped ordnance across distant rail yards, setting off massive eruptions of fuel and metal. Smoke rose like volcanic clouds. Hold formation, Hayes yelled. Radio operator, mark enemy positions. Walter slammed another ammo belt into place. A fighter roared past, so close he could see the pilot snarl through the glass. Walter fired too late. The fighter vanished beneath them. The ground blurred as the plane banked hard. Then a thunderous impact shook the fuselage. Left wing hit, Ned shouted from the nose. I don't know how bad. Walter felt the plane tilt dangerously. Hayes fought the controls. Another hit shook them. The bombers around them scattered some diving, some climbing chaos, tearing the formation apart. They weren't supposed to fight today. They were supposed to see. But war didn't care about orders. Another wave of fighters descended. Walter fired until smoke filled the compartment, hot brass casings piling around his boots. His shoulder burned from recoil. His throat tasted of metal. Then, a sudden flash. One of the German fighters broke apart mid-air, engulfed in flame. Another Mustang streaked past, American reinforcements arriving out of nowhere, engines roaring in furious salvation. The enemy broke, faded, fled. Night Beacon leveled out, wounded, shaking, but alive. Hayes pulled them into cloud cover, heading home. Walter slumped against the fuselage, chest heaving. The adrenaline slowly bled away, leaving a cold emptiness. Hours later, as the coastline appeared, Walter felt tears burn unexpectedly at the corners of his eyes. Not from fear, not from pain, from survival, from the realization that he was still breathing when so many weren't. Night Beacon landed hard, but safe. When Walter stepped onto solid ground, the air tasted different, sharper, cleaner, alive. Hayes approached him, placing a hand on his back. We'll fly again soon, he said. Walter nodded. But in his mind, for the first time, he wondered, how many tomorrows does a man get in a war like this? And how many skies must he survive before he can finally descend into peace? Rain stopped shortly before dawn, leaving the jungle thick with fog and a damp, uneasy stillness. Morrison woke to that silence too deep, too unnatural, and it set his nerves on edge. His head throbbed from the tunnel blast, his uniform stiff with mud, and every breath felt like he was inhaling the night's fear. Keller crouched beside him. "You awake?" "Trying to be," Morrison muttered. "Reyes?" Keller looked toward the bundled figure beneath two ponchos. "Hanging on, but we're out of time." Carter slid down from the ridge, with the precision of a man running on adrenaline alone. "No patrols nearby. Fog's thick. Best window we're gonna get." Morrison stood, though his legs trembled. "We carry Reyes. I'll take the first shift." "You can barely see straight," Keller said. "And you can barely stand," Morrison countered. Carter cut them off. "We rotate. No arguments." They lifted Reyes, whose feverish heat burned through the cloth, and moved into the choking green. For nearly an hour they advanced through twisting roots and low vines, every sound amplified by the quiet. Twice Morrison swore he heard footsteps behind them, but the jungle revealed nothing. Then a branch snapped. Carter signaled. They froze. Another crack. Slow. Close. A lone figure emerged through the fog. A Marine, soaked, limping, right arm bandaged. He stared at them like he wasn't sure they were real. Carter kept his rifle raised. "Identify yourself." The Marine dropped to his knees. "Private, Nolan, Fox Company." Morrison rushed forward, catching him before he toppled. "You hurt?" "Lost my squad." Keller lowered his rifle. "Hell, you're lucky we found you." Nolan's gaze drifted to Reyes. "He's bad. There's a field station northwest. Fox Company planned to regroup there, near a dried riverbed, white tarps, trenches." "How far?" Carter asked. "Half a day, maybe less." They didn't waste another second. The jungle thickened, the slope rising beneath their boots. Nolan stumbled, Carter steadying him. Reyes deteriorated rapidly, breathing ragged, skin burning with fever. Twice they stopped to keep him from choking. The pauses tore at their nerves. Then artillery rumbled in the distance. Keller froze. "That ours." "Only one way to find out," Carter said. They pressed on toward the sound until they reached a clearing, a bowl-shaped depression stripped bare. Morrison knew instantly what it was, the field station. Or what was left of it. White tarps hung in shreds, crates lay smashed, supplies scattered, blood darkening the soil. The silence was absolute. "Damn," Keller muttered. "We're too late." Nolan stared, crushed. I should have made it here." "No," Morrison said. "You survived. That's what counts." Carter scanned the tree line. "This place has been cold at least a day. We can't stay. If they hit it once, they'll sweep again." Nolan swallowed hard. There might be another fallback point. Heard a corpsman say if the riverbed went bad, head to the ridge cluster. West. "Then that's where we go," Carter decided. The ridges were brutal, steep walls of stone and mud, every climb a punishment. They took turns carrying Reyes, though their bodies protested with every step. Nolan tried once, but collapsed after a few yards. The sun dipped behind the canopy. Morrison's arms shook as he lowered Reyes for a brief rest. "We can't keep this up." "We'll make it," Keller insisted, though doubt crept into his voice. Then Morrison heard it. An engine. At first, faint so faint he thought it was the pounding in his own skull. But Carter heard it too. He crawled up the ridge and froze. "Morrison," he whispered urgently. "Get up here!" Morrison dragged himself beside him, and there it was. Lantern light flickering between tents, shadows moving, the unmistakable silhouette of a jeep. A Marine camp. "Holy hell!" Keller breathed. "We actually—" "Move!" Carter shouted. "This is our chance!" They lifted Reyes for the final stretch, stumbling down the ridge. Branches whipped their faces. Mud sucked at their boots. Morrison nearly fell twice, saved only by Carter's grip. Voices rose from below. "Over here! Hey, over here!" 5 Marines rushed up the slope, weapons lowered in disbelief, as they saw the 4 mud-soaked survivors carrying the 5th between them. "Corpseman!" a sergeant roared. "Get a stretcher now!" Hands lifted Reyes away. Medics sprinted into the tent. Keller and Carter collapsed to their knees while Nolan sagged against a tree, shaking from exhaustion. "You're safe," someone said. "We've got you." Morrison didn't remember blacking out, but he woke under a canvas roof, lying on a cot, clean bandages wrapped around him. The sounds of the jungle were distant now, replaced by the calm monotony of a functioning camp. Keller sat beside him. "You're back with us." Morrison's voice cracked. "Reyes?" "He made it," Keller said softly. "Weak." "You gave those medics a hell of a challenge." Morrison managed a faint smile. "Nolan?" "Getting treated. Arms infected, but they caught it early." The 3 men sat in tired silence, an earned silence, heavy with everything they had survived. "We shouldn't be alive," Morrison said quietly. "No," Keller admitted. "But we are." Carter looked out toward the ridgeline where lanterns flickered like distant stars. "That's the thing about war," he said. "Sometimes surviving is the only victory you get." Morrison closed his eyes. The jungle had taken so much from them. But not everything. Not yet. Night settled over the ridge camp like a soft curtain, the kind that didn't hide the war but dimmed it just enough for a man to breathe. Morrison lay awake long after the others drifted into exhausted sleep. The cot was comfortable, the blankets warm, yet he felt strangely displaced, like he'd stepped out of one world and hadn't quite landed in the next. Voices murmured outside, medics swapping shifts, a guard stamping his boots against the cold, the quiet clink of a canteen being set down. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds. And somehow, they made his heart ache. He rose slowly, head still tender, and pushed open the tent flap. The camp glowed under lantern light, every tent forming a little island of warmth against the dark jungle. Men moved quietly between them, tending to the wounded, checking, supplies, marking casualty lists. No shouting, no panic, just steady, practiced resolve. Keller sat by the fire pit, staring into the flames. "You're supposed to be resting," Morrison said softly. "So are you." Keller handed him a tin mug, half filled with weak coffee. "Stuff tastes like boiled socks, but it's warm." Morrison sipped it anyway. "Reyes? Asleep?" "Stable," Keller said, relief flickering across his face. "Doc thinks he'll pull through." The fire crackled. Morrison stared at the embers, every flicker reminding him of muzzle flashes in the tunnel, of shadowed passageways and suffocating air, and the sickening moment the ceiling collapsed. He shook the memory away. Carter approached from the dark, arms folded. "Nolan's asking for you two." They followed him to the medical tent. Nolan sat upright on his cot, pale but lucid, his arm wrapped in fresh bandages. "You look better," Morrison said. Nolan snorted. "Better than dying alone in a ditch?" "Yeah, I'd say this is an improvement." Keller laughed softly. It was the first time Morrison had heard him laugh in days. Nolan's expression sobered. "I heard from the sergeant. Fox Company took heavy losses. Might be a while before I'm back with anyone I know." "You're with us," Morrison said. "If you want to be." Nolan blinked, surprised by how much that seemed to matter. Yeah, I'd like that." Outside, another round of artillery rumbled far beyond the mountains unrelated to them, but a reminder that safety was temporary. The war hadn't ended. It had only stepped aside long enough for them to catch their breath. Carter looked at Morrison. "Command wants statements tomorrow. After that, they'll figure where to send us." "Back into the fight," Keller said quietly. "Eventually," Carter replied, "but not tonight." Morrison let his gaze drift across the camp over the lanterns, the tents, the silhouettes of men who'd fought, suffered, and somehow kept going. He felt a strange warmth inside him, equal parts pride and sorrow. They had made it. Against all logic, they had survived the tunnel, the jungle, the collapse, the endless miles of carrying a dying man on their backs. But survival wasn't the end of their story. It was only the proof they still had more to do. Morrison stepped outside, drawing in the cool night air. Somewhere in the darkness, the war waited. But so did tomorrow. And this time, they wouldn't be facing it alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.